Good evening. I'm Nell Braxton Gibson, tonight's moderator, and it is my honor to welcome you to this 2021 celebration of Absalom Jones. For over 4 decades, members of the Diocese of New York have celebrated the life of this remarkable hero who was the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church. This year, because of COVID-19, the annual worship service honoring Absalom Jones will be live streamed on Facebook on Saturday, February 20th at 10:30 a.m. Also this year, COVID-19 has presented us with an opportunity to include tonight's panel discussion, which honors the fact that Father Jones was more than the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church. He was also a community organizer, an essential worker, a teacher, and a founder of social justice organizations. In acknowledgement of some of this work, we have invited tonight's panelists to speak about Absalom Jones and the essential worker, yellow fever 1793 to COVID 2019. As moderator, I will begin with a few questions and invite our viewers to submit your questions in the Q&A or chat box. I also invite our viewers to enter your name and where you're from in the chat box. And now to our illustrious panelists who will join me. Tonight, we are pleased to have the Honorable Byron Rushing, former state representative of the state of Massachusetts and presently Vice President of the House of Deputies of the Episcopal Church. Representative Rushing is also a community organizer and activist, as well as a respected historian on African American culture and its legacy. We also welcome the Right Reverend Mary Glasspool, former suffragan bishop of the Diocese of Los Angeles, and a former priest in the dioceses of Los Angeles, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Massachusetts. As a priest in the Diocese of Massachusetts, she nominated the then priest Barbara C. Harris for suffragan bishop. Bishop Glasspool serves today as the Assistant Bishop of New York. Finally, we welcome Dr. Deborah Harmon Hines, Professor Emeritus of Radiology and retired Provost of the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is also the former Professor of Anatomy, Cell Biology, and Nursing at the UMass School of Medicine and Meharry Medical College. Dr. Hines served for 6 years as president of the National Union of Black Episcopalians and as a trustee of the Church Pension Fund. They are an impressive panel, and I'm privileged to have known each of them for over 35 years, which is why we have all agreed to call each other by our first names. Byron, I'd like to begin with you. In a publication called Black Nurses and the 1793 Philadelphia Yellow Fever Epidemic, a registered nurse named Elizabeth Hannock wrote that during the 1793 yellow fever, there was a huge exodus of able-bodied people from the city of Philadelphia. The same thing was true of New York City when it became the epicenter of the 2019 COVID pandemic. To what do you attribute the reason that those who can afford to escape cities where a pandemic is most virulent?
I think that is an important point, and an important point to start with. When I think the attitude of people of privilege and people who had the resources to leave Philadelphia was not unusual for any of these epidemics whenever they occurred in cities in the United States, and as they would continue well into the 19th century. I think, though, what makes Philadelphia stand out is, of course, it was the capital of the United States at the time. And so we had people we all have read about in our history books leaving. So Jefferson was there in Philadelphia and left. Washington was in Philadelphia and left. And a number of former signers of the Declaration of Independence were there and left. The irony, so I don't think that there is anything in our society then or now that would make it unusual for people who have the means to leave to safety, right, and leave other people behind. Sometimes being concerned about those people they left behind, but leaving them behind. And that certainly happened in Philadelphia in 1793. The irony, of course, of this is that the slaves of the people, of those slave masters who left, were also benefited by their slave masters leaving.
Thank you. Debbie, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I just wanted to highlight the fact that Philadelphia was not the only city hit by yellow fever at that time. Every major city in the United States, New Orleans, Savannah, Baltimore, Memphis, every major city was hit by not one, but a number of yellow fever epidemics. They seem to come every 3 or 4 years. And so what happened in Philadelphia was not unique. The other thing, excuse me, my cough drop just fell out. The other thing is that we celebrate Constance and her companions on Holy Men and Holy Women, the nuns who fought the yellow fever epidemic in the city of Memphis. But the people who did all the real taking care of the sick people and burying the people who had died from yellow fever were the Black people of Memphis.
It's important to add that Debbie, of course, was in the 1800s. That was 1878, if I remember my Book of Common Prayer correctly, because
but it had happened at least 5 times before that.
That's right. What's also interesting, I find, is how reluctant Episcopalians are to talk about any of this history. That is the only time Constance and what were called the martyrs of Memphis is the only time in our prayer book where we notice that there were Episcopalians doing this work. And of course, Absalom Jones was doing this work, and his colleagues were doing this work 100 years before. And I think I want to, and I'll keep coming back to this. I have found it just remarkable how difficult it has been for the Episcopal Church to publicly invite people in to mourn about COVID. And I think that is because a church that has a gospel that is full of healing has such a hard time talking about healing. It's like we don't really believe it. And a church that was probably the only Protestant church that prays for the dead, right, is so reluctant to publicly invite people in to mourn and to invite people to pray for the dead. And I think that these stories that we are telling this evening about Absalom Jones in Philadelphia is so important to focus on at this time. I just think it was a brilliant idea, Nell, to put together this combination of yellow fever and COVID.
Thank you. And thank both of you for bringing the Episcopal Church front and center in this discussion. While we're on the subject of spirituality, Mary, I want to turn to you. Absalom Jones drew upon his own spirituality in responding to so many things, including the yellow fever epidemic. Do you think it's important to understand his role in the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia? And does it really impact the role of the church today?
I believe it does now. And, I'm grateful. I feel very privileged myself to be a part of this discussion. And I'm learning a lot every minute from the panelists and from my own reading. Byron, one of the links that Byron gave was to a pamphlet that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen wrote in order to answer a pamphlet written by a guy named Matthew Carey, who impugned Black people who were originally thought to be immune from yellow fever, and that wasn't true. And I read the pamphlet, and it's fascinating reading. So there are three quick things the church can learn from this. One is the importance of telling the story. I mean, I'm so grateful that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen wrote it down. They not only refuted out of their own experience, but in response to what you asked, Nell, about spirituality, right off the bat, they wanted to be useful. They went to see the mayor of the city and said, how can we be useful in this? And in the pamphlet, it says, after some conversation, we found a freedom to go forth, confiding in him who can persevere in the midst of a burning fiery furnace, sensible that it was our duty to do all we could for our suffering fellow mortals. I mean, they had a sense of the common good that I think we generally don't think about a lot. They went out and helped bury dead bodies. They went in. They tell in this pamphlet of the times they go into a house where the father has died or the mother has died, the father is dying, and there are two kids there. And they did a lot of the work that white people and people who fled the city didn't want to do. So, the importance of telling the story, write it down, what I hope we're doing that in COVID. And the involvement, just because they were church people, didn't mean they couldn't get involved in healing. I mean, Byron and Debbie both sort of pointed that out. So I hope we as a church can recover that sense of healing of the whole person, including the community.
We are, of course, celebrating Absalom Jones this week. His day, of course, is the 13th. And I think I just cannot let it go by that we Episcopalians have the privilege of having Absalom Jones and Absalom Jones in our calendar. And we have that because Black Episcopalians recognized that the leader of the first independent congregation of Africans and people of African descent in the Episcopal Church was founded by a person who had been enslaved. And so Episcopalians have to, always come back to that because of our making this commemoration so important. We are not Episcopalians if we do not talk about slavery, right? And we have to just focus in on that. And Absalom, when he and the other members of the Free African Society volunteer to go do this work, had only been manumitted for 6 years. 6 years before this, I think Arthur Sutherland might be on our call today, and so he is my go-to person about Absalom Jones, and so he might correct me in the text. But it was only 6 years later that these newly freed men and women engaged in this work.
Thank you. And thank you both for reminding us how often we are all called upon to summon our better angels in conditions that could often bring out the worst in us. Debbie, I want to turn to you now for a medical question. Both yellow fever and COVID are and were deadly diseases. Although there was no vaccine for yellow fever in 1793, one has since become available. Today, we're in the position of developing COVID vaccines at the same time that we are fighting the disease and caring for people with the disease. Would you tell us what the yellow fever vaccine did that COVID cannot do today?
Okay, let me go between the two. An interesting fact is there was a slave in the late 1790s, Onesimus, who taught Cotton Mather how to do what was called variolation. You basically take a cut or a piece of the scab from someone who had yellow fever and put a cut on the next person and rub it in the wound as a way of inoculating. And that was taking the live agent, the live yellow fever agent. Now, at the time, they did not know it was a virus, okay? So on this continent, that was practiced for many years coming out of Boston because of what Onesimus taught Cotton Mather. The same idea is used to deal with COVID today. You take a piece of the virus, and for all of us old enough to have gotten polio vaccinations, the actual vaccination, you've got a scar on your arm. And it was basically taking live or what was called attenuated virus. They cooked it a little bit so it wasn't so bad, and they made a scab on your arm. Today, dealing with COVID, what they've done is taken one little piece of those spikes that you see. That is a protein, and that is what is injected into your body, and your body reacts to this foreign protein and produces antibodies. I got a call from a friend today who said she had gotten the first vaccination and it was itching like you know what. Well, that means those little antibodies are all gathering around that spot and they're doing their job. The second vaccination that you get is a so-called booster. And when you get that, that will even boost those antibodies to fight even more. Now, we may have to get boosters or vaccinations every year like we do for the flu because of how the virus mutates. But instead of injecting a whole virus or an attenuated or cooked virus, they just took a protein off of that spike and figured out how to make the antibodies react. So that's the big difference.
Thank you. You've really given us grist for the mill and a lot to ponder. And I would like to remind our viewers that there are links for information on COVID, as well as links on Absalom Jones and yellow fever that can be found in the chat box. And I encourage you to go there for additional information. Mary, you spoke earlier about Black people and how we've been left out of our common understanding about history. And that leads me to a question I'd like all three of you to answer, beginning with you, Mary, maybe followed by Debbie and then Byron. In the midst of the yellow fever epidemic, both Absalom Jones and Richard Allen cared for a Black and white, well-to-do and poor. And as a matter of fact, Richard Allen got yellow fever and thankfully recovered. They were doing this work at the same time that they had to fight against racial discrimination. Their fight brings to mind the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that took place around the world in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So this is a question for all three of you, beginning with you, Mary. Where do you think activists and essential workers of color summon the courage and commitment they show while dealing with deadly viruses and fighting racism at the same time?
Wow. You know, an honest answer to that, Nell, is I don't know. I mean, it takes a huge amount of courage, and you know, from reading the pamphlet, reading what Absalom Jones and Richard Allen wrote, what stands out to me is their faith in God, that the God who you know, protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace was right there with them. That they were really clear that they were doing God's work. And you're absolutely right. They, you know, they tended to rich and poor, mostly poor because the wealthy people, as we've already pointed out, had substance to leave the city and get to a safer place. And, you know, I think we should also remember that in 1793 in Philadelphia, there, you know, they weren't as scientific as Debbie just articulated. You know, they weren't studying germs or viruses under a microscope or anything. They really didn't know where yellow fever came from. I mean, it was 100 years later they figured out the mosquito thing. We look back on that and say, well, you know, how stupid can you be? They were right by the port. The people who got most sick were right by the Delaware River, where all the thing went. You know, the flash of yellow fever lasted from August through November, basically. And when the cold weather came, it kind of died out. But they didn't know that then, and so there were a lot of unknowns, just like with COVID. And Richard Allen and Absalom. Richard Allen was in the middle of building the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he stopped building the church to do this work. So it's amazing to me the amount of courage that it took. So I would say faith in God, a sense of the common good, that they talked about ministering to their fellow mortals. So they didn't separate out people and say, well, we're going to minister to these people and not these people. That's just about the best I can do in response to that. It just took a lot of courage. They walked into the unknown, and I'm so grateful that they wrote it down. In parts of this pamphlet that I read, Absalom Jones, I think, he talks about the cost, the literal cost in money. They took money out of their own pockets to do the work that was required. They paid other Black people to bury bodies or to nurse people, and they lost money. They weren't wealthy, but they were accused by this Matthew Carey of kind of extortion, and they had to put it all out there. So they put it all out there. They said this cost this, we paid this. There was a lot of people needing other people, and they did what was useful, and they served where they were needed.
I think that I disagree with Mary's just so clear statement, and I know how hard it is, but I think the answer is they really believed Jesus. They just really did. And there were certainly, there's no doubt that that some of them felt, certainly some of the leaders had even mentioned in their own discussions with each other that if they did this work, that they would be viewed as differently by the white community. You see, they would have more respect for them as former slaves if they did this work. But the main reason, I think, and certainly after, and it didn't take long for them to realize that Black people were not immune. And so why did they keep doing this as they watched their fellow workers die? And I can only explain that is deep commitment and faith that Jesus is real. And I see that on one hand as a model, but it certainly is a criticism of me when I don't think Jesus is real, when I don't take those risks. Yeah.
I thoroughly agree with both of you. And in my own faith journey, I know how my faith has increased. It was passed on to me by my parents, but I had to go through some things to really figure it out for myself. And I can see how deep their faith was. I've shared that I could not protest during the 60s because I could not buy into the philosophy of nonviolence. They told me to go home. I flunked nonviolence. But as I have matured, I think I'm getting there. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. And it's all because of my faith journey. And I'm sure it was entirely on their faith that they did these things.
So I really think it's so important for everyone who is on this webinar to think about ways that these stories are being told where they are, in their congregations, in their dioceses, where they are. And I think it's important for them to take a look at, certainly for those who are members of churches that are over 100 years old, they need to go look back on what were people doing in the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, 1920. On one hand, the Episcopal Church was like most Americans, and that it was too traumatic to remember. And so it literally was, it fell out of any of the corporate history of this country. Look around wherever you are. And where are the memorials to the people, the 675,000 Americans who died in the influenza pandemic? Where are the memorials to them? I suspect those of you who have old churches that are over 100 years old, you probably have more memorials to the veterans who died in the World War I than you have to your own congregants who may have died in the influenza pandemic. I think I've talked to many historians about that. We hate to talk about it. You know, even our friend Robert Pritchard doesn't mention it in his history of the Episcopal Church, right? You wouldn't know that influenza pandemic happened, right? But I think we need to focus on that. It's the liturgist who wrote me back when I was doing my search for this, and they say, most liturgists believe that it affected the 1928 prayer book. And it's the 1928 prayer book was the first time we added prayers for the dead. No one prayed for the dead in the Episcopal Church before the 1928 prayer book. Right? And it's also, and I think that, and everybody who gathered in that 1928 General Convention in Washington, D.C. had survived, had lived through the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1920, right? And it's a remarkable story. Families keep these stories, but we have not talked about it. And we have to be careful now, right? We have to be careful now that how little we are opening ourselves to people to pray for the people who have died and are dying in this epidemic. We, the Episcopal Church, there's only one site that I can find, website where you can regularly pray for people who have died, who ask the names of people who have died in the Episcopal Church, and that's the site for the Saturday morning virtual service at Washington Cathedral. Every diocese should be doing that. Right?
May I add a point of information about the influenza epidemic of 1918? There was a special CNN special report on the influenza epidemic, and it's only an hour long. I recommend people try to see it. It is a play-by-play of what has happened here with COVID, how the leadership thought that something else was important, didn't want people to know about it because they didn't want people to panic, and how the whole thing was treated, even wearing masks. And at that time, they still did not have a yellow fever vaccine. That wasn't until 1951. But it's an interesting learn, and it only takes an hour.
You know, if I can chime in on the 1918, 1919, I didn't know much about it. You know, growing up in this country, you learn a lot about World War I, and you barely hear anything about the influenza epidemic. And worldwide, 50 million people died, you know, worldwide. I mean, compare that number to the number of people who were killed in World War I, you know. One of the factors, I think, in terms of, and this is telling the story in a broader, bigger picture, is that so many people were ashamed of how people behaved during that pandemic. There were families that didn't want their children to come home. I mean, people just went like this, out of fear. And I'm not basing that on anything that I've read. In fact, I'm basing it on stuff that I haven't read. It's like, why don't we read the stories about this? And I just think there was a huge sense of corporate shame over how that was dealt with. And I don't want to survive COVID. I mean, I do want to survive COVID, but I don't want to get through this period and have us be ashamed of how we dealt with it. You know, are we learning or not? Are we caring for one another or not? And it's bigger a bigger deal than just tending the body. There's a spiritual sense about this, and we're all vulnerable, and we see our common humanity writ large, and all the divisions and separations are just coming right to the fore. And if following Jesus means we treat the sick and get out there and try to create the beloved community, we're going to have to deal with a lot of the stuff that we haven't dealt with.
Right.
Now, may I get back on the point of the workers then and now, and everyone
Yes.
that I know who's on the front line is a deeply, deeply religious person. And they pray before they go to work. They pray while they're at work. They pray over the people that are dying, whose families cannot be there. And they are deeply, deeply religious people and people of faith. And not just Christians. I have quite a few Muslims in my circle, and they do that as well. So it is the belief that in a higher power, absolutely, and they feel that they are doing God's work, taking care of God's people. And I think we miss the point. I think sometimes we overthink what we do, especially in the Episcopal Church. We make simple things very elaborate and very complicated, but the people I talk to on the front lines keep it simple.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank all of you for responding to that question. And this is another one for the three of you. I want to begin this time with you, Byron. One of the organizations that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen founded in 1781 was the Free African Society. And they established it to provide social services for free people of color in Philadelphia. How do you think that kind of work strengthens community ties? And how can we strengthen community ties today in the midst of the present pandemic?
I think that the history of the Free African Society is quite remarkable. But remember that this was happening in many northern cities also. It was difficult for societies like this to get going in the South because there was a lot more pressure on free Africans existing in those slave states than existed in the North. But what is remarkable is that people literally before they were free understood that if they became free, they would need to be organized. They would need to be able to protect themselves. That so many things that they would help them as enslaved, because it would help their masters, right? Because they were valuable, they were property, right? Masters generally took good care of slaves. They didn't want to lose all that money, right? But so they knew that separated from them, those masters, they would have to be organized as free people. I want to just say that they saw their primary work was among them as free people, but they never forgot that they were enslaved people. They knew the enslaved people. So who is Absalom Jones falls in love? Who does he fall in love with? He falls in love with Mary, who is an enslaved woman, right? So they know each other both as free and enslaved. And if they could if they could help the enslaved that they knew, they would do that too. And that society, of course, as early on understood that it was going to be open to every free Black person, but it was also going to be religious. And in a sense, it started out as a non-denominational religious organization, and it is members from that at the same who were going to St. George's Methodist Church. There's some historians debate exactly when the Free African Society got going, but they were functioning when the Black people get thrown out of leave St. George's, when they're forced to take seats in the balcony, literally the balcony that they helped pay for, because they helped build the balcony just to expand the church for everybody. And so when they leave, they're not leaving to nothing. They have this society already, that they and then in that society they decide what their next steps should be. And of course, one of the next steps is to set up an independent Black congregation. And just as an aside, because I think this is such a wonderful story, Richard Allen, of course, really did like Methodism. And so he urges the congregation to affiliate with the Methodist Church. And the congregation says no. The congregation says, no, you got to find another church for us to affiliate with. Why don't we affiliate with the Episcopalians? And Absalom Jones stays with that group as the leader of that group that wants to stay Episcopalian. And Richard Allen leaves to organize the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I just love that Black churches not only began with Absalom Jones, they began with a congregation making a decision about what they wanted to be.
Now I'd like to speak to that. And that's this whole idea of this benevolence society serving the needs of the people. And for me, churches should be doing that. And I think that's the reason many of our churches are dying today, is because they don't serve the needs of the people. My husband is a priest, and I traveled around with him while he was supplying around in the diocese. And the churches that he was supplying at were more like mausoleums. Live people don't live in mausoleums. They're only dead people in mausoleums. Everything was perfectly preserved. And I'm looking at the historic African Church of St. Thomas is now a COVID vaccination center.
Right.
Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City is a COVID vaccination center. They're taking care of our people. I don't understand why our Black churches are not getting online and registering their seniors who don't understand how to use the technology and making sure they get their vaccination. That's what benevolent societies do. They take care of people. And it's just so easy, but we get caught up on whether or not we're going to take communion in a little plastic cup or a big cup or, that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure Jesus is that hung up on it.
Thank you. Thank you both. We've got a question from one of our viewers. Many people serving in our churches feel exhausted. Is there evidence that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen felt the same way? Anybody who wants to respond?
Well, I think that they both if they did, they didn't write about it, and I suspect that they thought as leaders they should not. But they certainly served members who they knew were exhausted. And again, I go back to the fact that when they worked in that epidemic, right, they saw members of their society and of their individual churches dying, doing that work. So yes, they knew about exhaustion that comes from service. But, Jesus told us there's a yoke. I have to say, I don't want to be too hard on people who are feeling low and having and seem to be working harder. But I don't think Jesus would say, go on vacation. I really think, there is the yoke. He will make it lighter. you
Well,
know,
Byron,
buy
I'll disagree
into
with
the
you on
yoke.
that one. I think I'll disagree with you on that.
Okay.
And I want to draw parallels with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and the early 90s. We're human, we get tired. You do need to take a break. That's okay. But come back when you finish taking your break. You go to bed every night to take a break, but you may need to take a week off. Some of the healthcare workers work 3 months in a row, 6 and 7 days a week, but then they tell them you need to take a break. So as human beings, you have to take care of your own body and your own spirit and your own well-being. So I respectfully disagree with my elder.
Well, thank you, Debbie, for
I respectfully thank you for that, because, and I think you really helped in the answer to that question. Yes, thank you, Debbie.
yeah. I know that you know the exhaustion is it's kind of a different kind of exhaustion than it could have been in 1793. I mean, something that Byron said. I'm sure even free Africans did not want to complain much publicly, you know. So they're not going to talk about their exhaustion, you know. That's kind of a privilege for privileged people. But I think the kind of exhaustion that everybody's experiencing, or that many people are experiencing, and I'm grateful, Debbie, that you said, you know, take a break. It's kind of like the instruction we used to get, because I haven't flown in a plane for over a year, but used to get, you know, if the air masks come down, put your own on first before you know, and if you have more than one child, decide which one you like better or whatever. But you know, you got, if we're not healthy, we're going to lose our ability to serve. So it's really important. And Jesus himself, you know, goes off. We just been through Mark's gospel, where immediately he goes, you know, he heals Simon Peter's mother, and he goes off alone. He gets away from the crowd, you know.
He recharges batteries. You recharge your phone every night.
And
recharge your batteries.
We've got another question from a viewer, which kind of touches on what you were saying, Debbie. There's enormous racial inequality in people receiving the COVID vaccine. What can the church do to encourage vaccinations and address this inequality or inequity?
Well, the Union of Black Episcopalians has put out a video encouraging people to do it. I think it's on the UBE website.
And it's posted in the chat.
It's posted in our chat. The other thing is there are links where professional Black people who are healthcare professionals are endorsing it, getting the COVID vaccine. Within my husband's circle, my husband is Liberian, and there's a lot of distrust for the vaccine. And once he shared the video with them, many of them who are healthcare workers have said they will get the vaccine. And we get calls saying that. So we just need to talk to the people in our immediate circles, our immediate coverage areas. The more of us who get vaccinated, the better we'll be. Now, my husband and I both had COVID. Thank God we only had what I call COVID light. We did not have to be hospitalized. But it was the worst 2 weeks of my life, and I cannot imagine what full-blown COVID was. I was so miserable, I didn't even want to talk to him. My eyeballs hurt, okay? So the choice is to get the vaccine and feel some discomfort, or not get the vaccine and get COVID in any form. You don't want to play with that. You do not want to play with that. And we're still recovering from it. So I can't wait till I get mine. But here in West Tennessee, things are pretty disorganized.
Yeah. I thank you again, Debbie, for that. I the rollout of the vaccination is so chaotic, and I guess it's easy to point fingers and all, but I think a lot of we're dealing with racial inequality. I mean, it's just all of the other issues that we've touched on are coming out right in front of our eyes. And so, as a white person, um, I I want to make sure the education piece happens, and both you, Debbie, and Byron have mentioned this, but we have a couple of churches in the Diocese of New York. I'm pretty sure St. Luke's in the Bronx is a vaccination center. It's Caribbean West Indian. And we also have a church, I believe Messiah Rhinebeck, who decided that their ministry during this time is to help older people. Our first group in the state of New York was over 75, but now it's over 65. Help older people negotiate the online stuff, to teach them how to do that, because people have, on the one end of things, we're told that everybody who wants a vaccine will get it by June. So I said in another meeting the other day, I'm trying to stay calm and be patient. I don't need to run to the front of the line. I've registered and all, but it's pretty complicated from where I sit, and I'm pretty good at the computer.
Okay.
But I think we need to be doing more of that sort of education. See the video that you mentioned about done by the UBE. Make sure people are educated. Offer our churches as vaccination centers or whatever we can do to help, kind of thing. And I think we're slowly doing that.
Mm-hmm. There's this motto that if you teach a person how to do something, they can do it for life. In this case, for the senior citizens, just do it for them. Just do it. There's a priest in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, and I'm going to call her out. Her name is Tanya Wallace, and she put on her Facebook page, if you want to do it, just call me and I will do it for you. And she has registered at least 75 people so that they don't, you know what, you might end up throwing your computer away trying to get through all the things you have to do. Just do it for them in this case, and then make sure they can get there.
Exactly. Yep. Transportation.
Thank you. This is a last question, looking at the time, and this is also from one of our viewers. How can we serve at this time? I wanted so much to go work at a food bank distribution center, but didn't want to risk getting COVID. I've done other things and donated more money than I ever thought I could spare. But as a Christian, I'm conflicted that I'm not willing to risk getting sick.
I don't see anything wrong with that. I really don't see anything wrong with that.
No conflict. And
there's no conflict. That's right. And if she has computer skills, start registering people.
I agree with everything that was just said. No conflict. I think we all are called to do what we can, but nobody expects us to go expose ourselves or get intentionally sick or whatever. In fact, the opposite. We've been, kind of educated out the wazoo to, or at least told, wear masks, wash your hands, keep physically distant. And you know what? I'm going to say this and maybe Byron will, or Debbie or Nell will know, but I try not to use social distancing because I think it's connected with the history of racism and caste. And so I say physically distant.
Okay.
So that we don't confuse the fact. I mean, we're going to start talking about how do we get back into church? How do we rebuild the trust? Because we've taught everybody to do this, you know? It's going to be a long time till we pass the peace with a hug again, if ever. So, you know, we need to be talking about how, okay, when we get through this, when everybody gets vaccinated, how are we going to rebuild trust, and what's that going to look like?
I know that we really want to do things in person, and I definitely understand that. I can't tell you how difficult it has been for me not to go out on the streets after May 30th and be with the young people on the streets. So that, you know, so but I can't do that. But I can be in touch with them. You know, I can email them. I can make sure they know they're being encouraged. And I think that is what we all can find those things. But the most important thing is to be connected with other people. Right. And so if we can't do it in person, then let's write a few more cards than we would usually do to people. Let's let people know that we know that they are working on the front lines, or they are grieving. Let them know, right?
Mm-hmm. I agree. And in the words of Snoopy, wear the mask and keep your distance.
Yeah. And you know, Debbie, you brought up the AIDS epidemic. I wrote a little piece about we haven't, you know, Episcopalians are we like to say we do funerals well, but we haven't, you know, we haven't done funerals in the traditional way for the last year. When the AIDS epidemic happened, and particularly in this country, gay men were targeted and blamed. The LGBTQ now community came up with the quilt, the Names Project. Right. And you know, anybody could make a quilt with the name of somebody who died of AIDS on it and write their characteristics, and it's still going around the country, pieces of it. And it's a way to do a memorial and lament and grieve the people we've lost when we can't do that in a, you know, a traditional funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mary, for the new term of physically distanced. Did you want to say one last word, Byron?
No, just that I think that it is so important that our churches make it clear to the larger community, to the neighborhood that they are in, to the town that they are in, that they know that people are suffering, right? And if you need to put up flags in your yard, you know, prayer flags in your yard, whatever you do, so that people go by and know these Episcopalians, these Christians who happen to be Episcopalians, love us.
Okay. I have a quick point. The person at the head of one of the COVID vaccination teams was a young African American woman.
Yes.
Yes. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Representative Byron Rushing, Bishop Mary Glasspool, Dr. Deborah Harmon Hines, for sharing your considerable knowledge and insights with us as we explored Absalom Jones and the essential workers. And thanks to our viewing audience for joining us tonight. And I also want to thank the planning panel for this evening. Diane Pollard, Yvonne O'Neill, and Kyoko Toyama. And a special thanks to the Church of the Heavenly Rest for your technical support. We certainly could not have done this without you. And don't forget to join the Facebook live stream service for Absalom Jones on Saturday, February 20th at 10:30 a.m., where Representative Byron Rushing will be the preacher. A recording of tonight's panel discussion will be immediately available on Facebook. Good night.
Good night. Thank you so much, Nell. Wonderful.
Thank you and good
Yeah,
night.
thank you, Nell.
Thank you.